By the spring of 1941, the map of Europe had been stained a deep authoritarian gray. The Wehrmacht had shattered the French army in weeks, chased the British from the beaches of Dunkirk, and most recently trampled the Balkans in a lightning campaign that seemed to defy the very physics of modern warfare. But as the dust settled over the ruins of Athens, Adolf Hitler's eyes were already fixed on the vast, wheat-colored horizons of the Soviet Union. To the south, however, lay a jagged, mountainous obstacle that threatened the flank of his coming crusade: the island of Crete. Crete was more than just a piece of Mediterranean real estate. It was a stationary aircraft carrier, a strategic dagger pointed directly at the Romanian oil fields of Ploiesti, the lifeblood of the German war machine. For the British, it was the last bastion of hope in the eastern Mediterranean, a vital refueling station for the Royal Navy and a base from which they could strike back at the Axis underbelly. The stage was set for a confrontation that would break all the rules of conventional engagement. It would be the first time in history that an island would be conquered entirely from the air. The architect of this audacity was General Kurt Student, the commander of the Flieger Corps 11. Student was a man obsessed with the potential of vertical envelopment. He envisioned a new kind of soldier, the Fallschirmjäger, who could bypass trench lines and coastal fortifications by falling from the heavens like a modern thunderbolt. His plan, codenamed Operation Mercury, was a gamble of staggering proportions. It relied on the total synchronization of air power, glider-borne troops, and paratroopers, all descending simultaneously on the three main airfields of the northern Cretan coast: Maleme, Retimo, and Heraklion. But beneath the surface of this bold German ambition lay a rot of systemic failures. German intelligence, the Abwehr, committed one of the most catastrophic blunders of the war. They estimated the Allied garrison on Crete at a mere 5,000 demoralized troops, survivors of the Greek mainland collapse. In reality, there were over 40,000 soldiers waiting for them, including battle-hardened New Zealanders, Australians, and thousands of Greek regulars who had no intention of surrendering their soil. The German planners also failed to account for the geography. Crete was a rugged, prehistoric landscape of limestone cliffs and dense olive groves, terrain that favored the defender and turned every landing zone into a natural killing field. The irony of the situation was even deeper on the Allied side. Through the top-secret Ultra program, the British had cracked the German Enigma codes. General Bernhard Freyberg, the commander of the Cretan defenses, knew exactly when the invasion was coming, where the paratroopers would land, and even the specific units involved. Yet, Freyberg was hamstrung by his own strategic rigidness. He was convinced that the primary threat would come from a seaborne invasion. He positioned his best units to guard the beaches, leaving the vital airfields, particularly the high ground overlooking Malem, dangerously under-defended. It was a collision of two blind giants, each possessing half the truth, but neither able to see the full picture. On the morning of May 20th, 1941, the silence over Crete was shattered by the rhythmic drone of hundreds of Junkers 52 transport planes. To the soldiers on the ground, it looked like a dark cloud of locusts descending from the sun. Then came the silk. Thousands of parachutes blossomed in the sky, colors denoting the cargo. White for men, red for ammunition, green for medical supplies. It was a beautiful, terrifying spectacle. But as the Fallschirmjäger drifted downward, the beauty vanished. They were jumping with a fatal technical flaw. The German parachute harness was a single-point attachment, meaning the soldier fell slightly face down and had almost no control over his descent. Worse yet, they jumped armed only with pistols and knives. Their rifles and submachine guns were dropped in separate canisters. As the first wave hit the ground near Malmö, the carnage was immediate. The New Zealanders of the 5th Brigade were waiting in the olive groves with Bren guns and rifles. Many Germans were shot before they even touched the earth. Others were dragged across the rocky ground by their chutes, unable to reach their weapon canisters. The elite of the German military, the 1st Assault Regiment, was being systematically dismantled in the first hour of the operation. Near the Tavronitis Bridge, the carnage was so absolute that the river itself began to run red. The German plan was disintegrating. Communication was non-existent. Officers were dead, radios were smashed, and the survivors were pinned down in shallow ditches, praying for the sun to set. While the professional soldiers fought among the ruins, a new and unexpected terror emerged for the German paratroopers. The Cretan people. German doctrine had assumed the local population would remain passive or even welcome them as liberators from British colonial rule. They were wrong. As the paratroopers drifted into the villages, they were met by old men with flintlock rifles, women with kitchen knives, and boys with stones. This was an asymmetric fury that the German High Command had never factored into their cold, mathematical equations. In many cases, paratroopers who landed off target were hacked to death before they could unbuckle their harnesses. This civilian resistance would later trigger a cycle of brutal reprisals. But in the heat of May 20th, it was a systemic shock that paralyzed the German rear. By the evening of the first day, Kurt Student sat in his headquarters in Athens, staring at a map that showed only disaster. Not a single airfield had been captured. His elite units were decimated. The Royal Navy had already moved into the straits to intercept any sea reinforcements. According to every rule of military logic, Operation Mercury was a failure. But war is often decided not by the brilliance of the victor, but by the single, inexplicable mistake of the loser. At Malmö, that mistake was embodied in the withdrawal from Hill 107. The commanding officer of the 22nd New Zealand Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, mistakenly believed his lines had been overrun. Under the cover of darkness, he ordered his men to pull back from the heights overlooking the airfield. This was the hinge of fate. When the sun rose on May 21st, the Germans realized the hill was empty. Despite the harrowing fire from remaining Allied pockets, they began to crash-land Junkers B-52s directly onto the runway, often over the wreckage of planes that had landed minutes before. They were no longer paratroopers. They were air mobile infantry, being fed into the meat grinder to hold the tiny strip of concrete at Maleme. This was the moment the systemic failure of the German plan met the tactical failure of the Allied defense. The Germans now had a toehold, and they began to pour in the 5th Mountain Division, the Gebirgsjäger. These were rugged alpine troops, trained for the exact kind of vertical terrain that Crete offered. As the focus shifted to the airfields at Retimo and Heraklion, the story was one of desperate, isolated heroism. At Heraklion, the Black Watch and the Australian battalions fought with a ferocity that stunned the German invaders. The paratroopers there were slaughtered in even greater numbers than at Malem, with some units losing 80% of their strength in minutes. But the success at Malem acted like a siphon, drawing Allied resources away and allowing the Germans to build a bridgehead. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, was paying a horrific price to prevent the German sea convoys from reaching the island. Without air cover, the legendary Mediterranean fleet was hunted by the Stuka dive bombers of Flieger Corps 8. The cruisers Gloucester and Fiji were sent to the bottom, and the battleship Warspite was heavily damaged. The sea was no longer a sanctuary. By May 26th, the Allied position had become untenable. Freyberg, realizing that the loss of the airfields meant the Germans could reinforce indefinitely while his own men were being starved of supplies, ordered a general retreat across the White Mountains to the southern port of Sfakia. This was a march of pure agony. Thousands of men, exhausted, thirsty, and hunted by the Luftwaffe, scrambled over goat tracks in a desperate race to reach the evacuation ships. It was here that the unsung heroes emerged. The rear guard units, often comprised of Australians and New Zealanders who volunteered to stay behind and face certain death or captivity, so their comrades could escape. They fought from cave to cave, ridge to ridge, holding back the Gebirgsjäger with bayonets and empty rifles. The evacuation at Sfakia was a haunting echo of Dunkirk, but on a much smaller and more tragic scale. Under the cover of night, the Royal Navy performed miracles, whisking away nearly 18,000 men. But as the last destroyers pulled away into the morning mist of June 1st, 5,000 men were left behind on the beaches. They were the abandoned, the sacrificial lambs of a campaign that had been lost through a series of hesitations and missed opportunities. Among them were the Cretan partisans, who now faced the full, unrestrained vengeance of a frustrated German army. The island had fallen, but the price paid for it would resonate through the rest of the war. When the final casualty reports reached Hitler's desk, he was horrified. The 7th Flieger Division, the pride of the Luftwaffe, had been effectively bled white. Nearly 4,000 paratroopers were dead or missing, and thousands more were wounded. The Junkers 52 transport fleet had been shattered, losing hundreds of aircraft that would be desperately needed for the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler summoned Kurt Student and told him, "Crete has shown that the days of the paratrooper are over. The surprise factor has worn off." The German paratroopers would spend the rest of the war fighting as elite infantry on the ground, never again to be in a major airborne operation. The victory was so costly that it was, in every practical sense, a defeat. There is a profound historical irony in the legacy of Crete. While Hitler abandoned the concept of airborne warfare because of the losses, the Allies looked at the operation and saw its potential. They studied students' mistakes, redesigned their parachutes, improved their communication, and integrated their gliders. The lessons learned in the bloody olive groves of Maleme would eventually lead to the massive, successful drops of D-Day and Operation Market Garden. The Fallschirmjäger had provided the blueprint for their own eventual obsolescence. They had won the island, but they had lost their future as a weapon of strategic surprise. The tragedy of Crete is a testament to the chaos of human conflict. It was a battle where the side with the best intelligence lost, and the side with the most flawed plan won. It was a clash of 20th century technology against ancient, primal resistance. Today, the hills of Maleme are quiet, covered in the silver-green leaves of olive trees that have witnessed centuries of upheaval. The German cemetery at Malem stands as a grim reminder of the hubris of a high command that treated elite soldiers as expendable statistics. The rows of flat gray stones look out over the Aegean, marking the final resting place of a generation of young men who fell from the clouds into a nightmare they didn't understand. In the final analysis, Operation Mercury was the graveyard of the German airborne, but it was also the birthplace of a new era of warfare. It proved that no fortress is impregnable if the enemy can strike from above, yet it also proved that technology and surprise are no match for the sheer, stubborn will of a people defending their homes. The ghosts of Crete remain, whispered in the wind that blows through the Samaria Gorge and recorded in the scars on the walls of the villages. It remains a stark lesson in the limits of power and the unpredictable nature of the human spirit when pushed to the edge of the abyss. As we look back through the lens of history, the invasion of Crete stands as a bridge between the old world of linear battles and the new world of three-dimensional, total war. It was a moment of terrifying transition, where the sky itself became a front line. The sacrifice of the New Zealanders, the Australians, the Greeks, and the Cretan civilians was not in vain, for they forced the Axis to pay a price so high that the German eagle never again dared to spread its wings over the sea. The campaign ended in a tactical victory for the Reich, but it was a moral and strategic wound from which their airborne ambitions would never recover. The silence of the Mediterranean today belies the storm that once broke over these shores, a storm made of silk, fire, and the desperate courage of men caught in the gears of a failing machine. The sun sets over the white mountains, casting long shadows over the landscape where the fate of the Mediterranean was once decided. The story of Crete is not just a story of maps and maneuvers, but a narrative of systemic failure met by individual bravery. It is a reminder that even in the most calculated plans of generals, the smallest oversight can lead to catastrophe, and the humblest defender can change the course of history. The silk has long since rotted away. The wreckage of the Junkers has been reclaimed by the earth, but the memory of those 11 days in May remains etched into the soul of the island. A tragedy, a triumph, and a warning from the shadows of the past. The documentary of Operation Mercury concludes here, not with a flourish of trumpets, but with the somber realization that in war, even the winners can be left with nothing but a graveyard. The lesson of Crete is that the sky belongs to no one, and the earth demands a heavy price from those who try to claim it from above. We leave the island as it was before the planes arrived, rugged, beautiful, and unconquered in spirit. The echoes of the Guy have faded, leaving only the sound of the waves and the eternal vigil of those who stayed behind to hold the line against the falling sky. Me.
days of the paratrooper are over. The Führer sighs. 4,000 grey stones under pale Aegean skies. The lessons of Malane bought with iron and tears. A blueprint for D-Day in the following years. The waves wash the shore, the sky is now clear. Sleep well, fallen wolves. The silence is here.